Mr. Musk, she said, her voice soft but serious. I have a question for you. Musk didn't expect was to be stopped by a little girl with dark curls and eyes that seemed to hold questions bigger than the universe he was trying to explore. Ellen smiled warmly, assuming it would be something light-hearted, perhaps about rockets or space travel. Children usually asked him if he'd seen aliens, or if they could ride in one of his cars. Sure, he replied without hesitation, crouching down to meet her at eye level. The little girl looked directly into his eyes and asked, "What do you think happens when we die?" Ellen was taken aback. This was not what he expected from a child so young. He tried to hide his surprise, but the depth of her question made him pause. He looked at her innocent face, wondering how such a young child could ask something so profound. He had built rockets that touched the stars, developed artificial intelligence that mimicked human thought, and revolutionized electric cars that changed how people moved across the earth. But this question touched something deeper inside him than any engineering problem ever had. "That's a very big question," he said slowly, suddenly aware that the usual confidence in his voice had faded. "You know, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I think." The room grew quiet around them. The hustle of the hospital seemed to fade away. Staff members who had been chatting nearby fell silent, now listening to their conversation. The little girl waited patiently, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes never leaving his face. "You see," Ellen continued, carefully choosing his words, "there are many things in this world that we don't fully understand yet. Science helps us learn about the universe, about stars and planets, but there are still mysteries we don't have answers for." He shifted his weight, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Could he answer this question in a way that made sense to a child? The girl's wide, expectant eyes were waiting for something meaningful, something that could help her understand the greatest mystery of all. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, "we don't really know what happens when we die. But one thing I believe is that this beautiful earth, this world we live in, is full of wonder, and I think in a way, we're all part of something bigger." The girl's eyes narrowed slightly as she processed his words. She wasn't satisfied with just that answer. There was more on her mind, questions building upon questions. "Are you saying that when we die, we just go back to being part of the stars?" she asked, tilting her head. Her voice carried uncertainty, but it was clear that her curiosity wasn't satisfied with simple answers. Ellen hadn't thought of it that way before. The question was too vast, too profound for a simple answer. He scratched his chin, feeling the weight of her expectation. This wasn't about technology or business models or innovation. This was about something that touched the very essence of human existence. "I don't know," Ellen admitted, shaking his head, "but maybe we don't need to know everything right away. Maybe it's okay not to have all the answers." The little girl looked at him for a long moment, processing his words. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter but with a depth that made Ellen feel something stir inside him. "But what if there is a God?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face for an answer. Ellen's heart skipped a beat. God, it wasn't a question he expected to be asked, and it stirred something inside him. This little girl had just asked what everyone else was too afraid to ask, the question that hung in the balance between science and faith, between knowing and believing. He took a deep breath. He had been raised in a world of logic, of innovation, of cold hard facts, but this question was warm and came from somewhere deep in the heart. "I think," Ellen began, choosing his words carefully, "that everyone believes different things. Some people believe in God, others believe in science, and some tried to blend both. But no matter what, I think having faith in something bigger than ourselves can give us hope. The girl's face brightened slightly. She wasn't expecting that answer, but it was enough to make her think, to consider possibilities she hadn't before. But what if God isn't real? She asked, almost afraid to voice the thought, her voice trembling slightly. Ellen paused again. This conversation was becoming more challenging than any interview or presentation he'd ever given. Could he give her an answer that would comfort her without dismissing her fears? I don't know if I can answer that for you, he said honestly, but I think it's okay to ask those questions, and maybe that's the first step to finding the answers you're looking for. The little girl sat quietly for a moment, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ellen wondered if he had said the right thing. He could see the wheels turning in her head, but he also noticed a hint of sadness in her eyes. You know, I've always wondered if God is real, the little girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes I'm scared. What if I never find out? Ellen felt his heart ache. He couldn't help but recognize the fear in her words, same fear that many adults carried with them. The fear of uncertainty, of the unknown. Could he help her find peace in a world full of questions without answers? He bent down closer to her, looking into her eyes with warmth and understanding. It's okay to be scared, he said softly, but remember, you're never alone. There are people who care about you, and there's always something to believe in. Even when you're unsure, it's okay to keep looking for answers. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes full of emotion. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had stopped turning. Then, slowly, tears began to roll down her cheeks. Ellen was taken aback by the tears. He didn't know what to do at first. He wasn't used to seeing children cry, especially after philosophical conversations about the nature of existence. But he realized that the little girl had been holding in a lot of emotions, and his words had touched something deep inside her that needed release. He reached out gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. The human connection felt important, more important than any technological connection he had ever created. Hey, he said softly, it's okay to cry. Sometimes we all need a little release. But remember, you don't have to have all the answers today. You can keep asking questions, and that's what's important. She nodded through her tears, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The moment felt like it was stretching on forever, but somehow Ellen knew that this was one of the most meaningful moments he had ever experienced. As the little girl wiped away her tears, Ellen stood there feeling a strange sense of peace. It was as though the conversation had changed something in him. He wasn't just a man of science and technology anymore. He was a man who had just witnessed the raw, vulnerable side of humanity. Thank you for asking me that, Ellen said softly. I may not have all the answers, but you've made me think in ways I never did before. The little girl smiled weakly, looking up at him with a new understanding in her eyes. She didn't have all the answers either, but for the first time, she felt okay with that uncertainty. Ellen turned to walk away, but as he did, he looked back one last time. The little girl was still sitting there, lost in thought, but now there was a sense of peace in her face. Sometimes the simplest questions could change everything, and for Ellen, this moment would stay with him forever. The quiet hum of the hospital filled the air as Ellen walked down the hallway. The small girl's question echoed in his mind, lingering in a way he hadn't expected. He had answered her as best he could, but somehow it didn't feel like enough. Was it enough? Had he said the right things? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important. As he made his way toward the elevator, he thought about his life. his companies, his visioned future he worked so hard to create. But in the midst of all that ambition and innovation, had he forgotten something more important? What if that little girl was asking for more than just answers? What if she needed reassurance, comfort, and hope? What if we all did? He thought about his childhood, how he had always been the curious one, constantly questioning everything. He had never been afraid to ask why, even when the answers didn't make sense. And yet, when it came to something as profound as life, death, and God, he felt like he was walking in the dark, just as lost as anyone else. His mind wandered back to the conversation. He wondered if there was something more to explore there. He had talked about science and the universe, but what about faith? Could science and faith coexist in a world that often pitted them against each other? The following days passed, and Ellen couldn't shake the memory of the little girl's face. It seemed like a small, fleeting moment in his busy life, but it felt much more significant to him. He began to think about the question she had asked it about God, about life after death. For the first time in a long while, Ellen found himself searching for answers, but not the kind of answers he usually sought. This wasn't about technology or the future of humanity, it was about the bigger picture, the questions that existed beyond the realm of science. He spent evenings reading books about faith, philosophy, and the mysteries of existence. He spoke to friends and colleagues who believed in different things, hoping to understand their perspectives. Each conversation opened new doors, but none of them felt like a complete answer. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. But as time passed, something began to change inside him. He started to see a pattern. Maybe the answer wasn't about having everything figured out. Maybe it was about accepting that there were things beyond human understanding, mysteries that science couldn't solve with equations and experiments. One night, as he sat on his balcony staring at the stars that he had dreamed of reaching since childhood, Ellen felt a strange peace wash over him. Perhaps the answer wasn't as important as the question itself. Perhaps the act of searching for meaning, for truth, was just as valuable as the truth itself. It was several weeks after his encounter with the girl, when Ellen found himself at a dinner party. The event was filled with some of the most brilliant minds in the world: scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, and philosophers. They gathered to discuss everything from space exploration to artificial intelligence, the very fields that had defined Ellen's career. But as the night wore on, the conversation shifted toward the nature of the universe and, surprisingly, faith. As the discussion grew deeper, Ellen remained quiet, listening intently. He had heard arguments from both sides. Some believed in the power of science while others had a strong belief in a higher power. But there was one person, an elderly woman sitting across from him, who hadn't spoken yet. Her eyes were kind, and there was a wisdom in her gaze that seemed to hold more knowledge than words could express. Finally, she turned to Ellen and said, "What do you think, Mr. Musk? You built rockets, reached for the stars, but what do you believe when you look up at the night sky?" Ellen hesitated for a moment, surprised by the question. It wasn't just a question about technology, it was a question about something much more personal. He thought about the little girl and the questions she had asked. He thought about his search for answers over the past weeks. Could he answer this woman the way he had answered the girl? "I think," he began slowly, "I think the universe is full of mysteries, and as much as we try to understand everything, there's always something beyond our grasp. Maybe that's the beauty of it, mystery itself." The woman nodded thoughtfully. And do you think that mystery is a sign of something bigger? Alan looked up at the sky, deep in thought. Maybe, I think it's possible that there is something beyond what we can see, something that connects us all. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's okay not to. Maybe the search itself is what matters. The woman smiled warmly, as though she had known the answer all along. The search is everything, she said softly, and sometimes it's the questions that bring us closer to understanding. A few months later, Alan found himself at the same hospital again. He had come to visit a friend, but as he walked through the hallway, he felt something tugging at his heart. He remembered the little girl, the one who had asked him about God. He wondered if she was still there, if she had found any of her answers. He made his way to the waiting room, and sure enough, he saw her sitting in the same spot. She was older now, maybe by a year, but she still had that same curious expression, that same light in her eyes that sought understanding. This time she noticed him right away and stood up, walking toward him with a smile that lit up her whole face. "Mr. Musk," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "You came back." Alan smiled warmly, crouching down to her level. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice gentle. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really? About what happens when we die?" Alan nodded. "Yes, and about everything you asked me. I've been searching for answers, but I've realized something important." The girl looked up at him with curiosity. "What did you realize?" "I realized that sometimes it's okay not to have all the answers," Alan said, "but the search for meaning, the asking of questions, that's what matters most. It's a journey we're all on, and it's one that connects us all." The little girl smiled, her face filled with a quiet understanding that seemed beyond her years. Maybe she didn't have all the answers either, but that was okay. She had come to understand that asking the right questions, seeking truth, and keeping an open heart were the most important things. Ellen stood up, looking at her one last time. "Keep asking questions, okay? Keep searching for what feels right to you." The little girl nodded solemnly. "I will. Thank you, Mr. Musk." And as Ellen turned to leave, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt before. Sometimes the most profound answers don't come from the answers themselves, they come from the questions we ask and the way we search for truth. From that day forward, Elon Musk's perspective on life began to shift. He continued to chase his dreams, to push the boundaries of space exploration and innovation. But he also became more open to the mysteries of the world, those that couldn't be explained by science alone. He realized that sometimes faith and curiosity could coexist, creating a richer understanding of the world and our place in it. And though he didn't have all the answers, he was okay with that. He had learned that the search for meaning was just as important as the destination. As for the little girl, she continued to grow, always asking questions, always seeking answers. She knew that life wasn't about having everything figured out, it was about learning, growing, and understanding that the search for truth was a journey that could last a lifetime. And Elon Musk knew, deep down, that in a way, the little girl had given him the answers he needed all along. Not answers about God or death or the afterlife, but answers about what it meant to be human, to question, to wonder, to seek understanding in a world full of mysteries. As Elon continued his journey of discovery, he found himself sharing his thoughts more openly with others. Whether they were colleagues, friends, or strangers, the questions the little girl had asked lingered in his mind, often surfacing in conversations and quiet moments of reflection. He had realized that seeking answers wasn't about finding certainty, but about embracing the unknown with humility and curiosity. In a world so focused on solving problems, perhaps the biggest lesson was to simply keep wondering. One evening, as he looked up at the stars once more, he felt an overwhelming sense of connection not just to the vastness of space, but to the lives he touched, the questions asked, and the answers that could never truly be fully known. In that moment, Ellen understood something profound. No matter how far humanity reached, the search for meaning was a thread that wove them all together across time and space. And sometimes, the most important discoveries didn't happen in a lab or on a rocket, but in the quiet moments of introspection, when we dared to ask the biggest questions of all. Years later, Ellen would often think back to that little girl with the big question. He never saw her again after their second meeting, but he carried her words in his heart. Her simple curiosity had sparked a change in him, and in a way, she had shown him the importance of embracing faith. Alongside his work in science and technology, she had reminded him that there was more to life than progress and success. It was about connection, belief, and understanding the mysteries that kept us searching. And perhaps, in the end, was the search itself that gave life its deepest meaning. As his rockets reached further into space, and his innovations changed the world in ways he had only dreamed of, Ellen never forgot the lesson he learned from that one simple question. In a universe full of stars and planets, of vast distances and unimaginable wonders, sometimes the greatest mystery of all was the human heart and its capacity to ask questions that transcended science itself. And in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the world had gone to sleep, Ellen would look up at the stars and wonder, not just about the mechanics of the universe or the physics of space travel, but about the deeper questions, ones that science alone could never answer. In those moments, he felt closest to understanding, not because he had found all the answers, but because he had learned to embrace the questions, and in that embrace, he had found something greater than certainty, had found peace. The peace that comes from knowing that it's okay not to know everything, that the journey of discovery is as important as the destination, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the simple curiosity of a child who isn't afraid to ask the biggest questions of all. And so, as the stars continued to shine and the universe continued to expand, Elon Musk continued his search not just for new technologies or new frontiers, but for meaning in a world full of mystery. And perhaps that was the greatest adventure of Alf, one that took place not in outer space, but in the infinite space of the human heart and mind. The search continued, as it always would, guided by the light of curiosity and the courage to ask questions that might never have definitive answers. But in that endless search, in that constant questioning, there was a beauty that transcended understanding, the beauty that connected us all across time and space, in the shared journey of discovery. And in the end, isn't that what it means to be human? To question, to wonder, to seek understanding even when answers seem out of reach, to look up at the stars and ask not just how they work, but why they're there at all. These were the questions that the little girl had awakened in Elon Musk, and these were the questions that would continue to guide him long after their brief encounters had faded into memory, because some questions, once asked, can never be unasked. They become part of who we are, shaping our journey through a universe that will always hold more mysteries than answers. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be.